Bună ziua. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to be an invited speaker. I am from Japan in the East, and now I'm in the West. Today, I would like to overview what I learned from the West. Since I was young, I have been fascinated by the Western architecture and cities. I have always thought that architecture and cities were interesting because they all have their own places and histories. My specialty is architecture. I have visited Romania for 7 times. In 2007, I visited Galați for the first time, and since then, I have seen many aesthetic cities and architecture in Romania. In 2009, I was in Cluj-Napoca. 2011, Iași. The more I visited the West, I think I learned the more from the West. 2013, Timișoara. I have seen many beautiful plazas. 2015, Brașov. Last time, 2 years ago, Constanța. By now, visiting Romania in every 2 years became a part of my life. Yesterday I was in Tokyo. I had my classes and a meeting in the afternoon. At 5 p.m., I rushed to the Tokyo airport and catch the 9 p.m. flight to Istanbul. This morning, I arrived Bucharest airport, and now I'm here in Craiova. Romania is quite close. I started studying architecture in the 1980s. I belong to a geometry and graphic research studio in a department of architecture. At first, I would like to talk about the memory of my former teacher. My mentor was Professor Masahiro Chatani, who was famous for origamic architecture, which uses origami to express architectural forms. The origamic architecture is an expression of architecture's figurative image in a postcard-sized pop-up white card. Origamic architecture has several different types. 90 degrees angle types are often used to express architectural figures. The figure will appear when papers are opened in 90 degrees. 180 degrees angle types are produced by 3-dimensional figures with attached pieces of papers on folding pasteboard. The 3-dimensional figures is folded in a sheet of paper. We once published a thesis about the origamic architecture. Professor Chatani expressed hundreds of architecture from all over the world by origamic architecture. The figures that described by the origamic architecture are simplified models of architecture. So we analyzed not actual architecture, but these simplified figures to find out some characteristics of architectural forms. We calculated some characteristics of figures, such as the maximum height, width, skyline deviation, which shows the deflected degree of rooftop skyline, number of blocks such as windows, doors, and wall elements, entropy of blocks, which is the complicated degree of the blocks in the figure, occupancy of the largest block, number of openings, quantity of openings, occupancy of the largest opening. By using 9-form data, 3 principal components were extracted by the factor analysis: rhythm, silhouette, symbol. High-rise buildings which have conspicuous silhouette and columns or churches which have individual external forms have high silhouette property. Bridges with unique openings under their long span and architecture with originally designed entrance or with arranged openings have high symbol property. When the rhythm property, which stands for the complexity of figures, is excessively weak, their forms look simple. These are forms with the intermediate rhythm property and the symbol property, and the minus range silhouette property. In these forms, rhythm property and silhouette property are both considerably high. Thanks to Professor Chatani, I became an explorer of architectural forms. Let me introduce my first study on the West. About 30 years ago, in my 20s, I started my study on European plazas. In Europe, there are many aesthetic plazas, which are common spaces in the cities. I traveled around Europe to see plazas. Pleasantly surrounded by walls and windows, the plazas are spaces that makes me feel as if I am in a theater. I analyzed the characteristics of the forms of the plazas and their connecting streets. The plazas are not too small or too large. The architecture that surrounded them is rich in variety, such as the presence of high towers and the continuation of roofs in rhythmic patterns. To analyze the forms of the plazas, I made simplified computer graphics models, which were made by MS's computer. At the time, personal computer used to maneuver by self-programming, and only 8 colors could be used. I made models of 43 European plazas. The elements such as walls, windows, roofs, and so on are described by different colors. These are plazas in Italy, Spain, Germany, France, Belgium, and Austria. I think I could find out some characteristics of the forms regarding areas and compositions by calculating the colored pixels in these models. For example, the roundness of the plane forms could be calculated by the relationship between the area and the circumference. The height of the elevations could be calculated by counting pixels as well, and the degree of concave and convex shapes of the elevations could be calculated by standard deviations of the skyline heights. The proportions of the plane form and the elevations were interesting characteristics. The most interesting characteristics to me was the composition of the openings on the walls. I think the plazas are spaces not only surrounded by walls, but also surrounded by windows and doors. I was enthusiastic to calculating the opening ratios of the plazas, that is the area of the windows and doors to the walls. For example, the opening ratio of the Piazza della Signoria in Firenze was 23%, and that of the Piazza del Campo in Siena was 90%. I noticed that the opening ratio of the plazas are roughly around 20%. Besides the opening ratio, I have been interested in the composition and the arrangement of Western architectural forms, and those studies have become my asset. In 2009, at the conference in Cluj, I presented a method to generate windows on walls by computer calculation. In the program, boxes and windows are arranged randomly, but their shapes, sizes, numbers, and so on were controlled by algorithm. The windows were arranged not to overlap to have a certain distance from the edge of the walls or the adjacent windows. This form is quite different from the European plazas, but I think I can point out that the opening ratio of this model is about 20%, which is equivalent with that of the plazas. Today, we can easily generate forms by Grasshopper scripts. These are student works of my class named Digital Studio. In this class, I always ask students to calculate the opening ratio, and those were often around 20%, which is like the plazas. I think the opening ratio of the plaza is a magic number of the architectural form. One of my students designed a church based on a study of the opening ratio of European churches. I think that analysis and design in architecture have opposite processes. The analysis is decomposition and the design is composition. When some characteristics are elucidated by the analysis, we might be able to utilize them more effectively in design.
Besides plazas, I learned a lot from the Western architecture. I love the space of the pantheon of ancient Roman architecture that composed of one sublime sphere, but I also love the Hagia Sophia of Byzantine architecture, which have a complex form with consecutive domes.
I once tried to design a museum by using spheres. This form was inspired by the Pantheon and also the Hagia Sophia, which have complex form with consecutive domes, but also has the clear-cut structure of a pendentive dome. Things that look complicated are often based on somewhat simple and clear principles. These are some students' attempts of spherical form designs. Back to 2013 at the ICEGD conference in Timisoara, I presented a design of furniture composed by paper tubes. I think this design was a former idea of arranging spheres. The algorithm used here was a simple procedure of filling paper tubes randomly in a designated area. This is one of the number of patterns. After the arrangement is decided, the tubes were joined, and it became a shelf. Obviously, this shelf is tricky to use. However, I think these various size tubes may induce a variety of usage. Maybe this is not good for a human, but good for a cat. I think various compositions and arrangements of forms were a significant idea of what I learned from the West. Now, let me talk about the difference of cityscapes in the West and the East. At the last ICEGD conference in Constanza, I introduced a case study in which I designed a small plaza in a typical Japanese residential area. In this district, there used to be traditional streetscapes with black fences, but by now it is disappearing. I tried to insert a little plaza in this streetscape, which is open space to the street. In the West, as seen in the famous map of Noli, which colored the buildings to indicate the public spaces of Rome, the public spaces, such as street and plazas, were clearly formed by the arrangement of buildings. However, in the typical Japanese city, the buildings are not lined up facing to street and not adjacent to each other. They seem to be arranged disorderly. The spatial compositions of the streetscapes of the West and the East are quite different. In traditional Japanese cities, building elevations seldom separate private and public spaces, as many private items overflow into the street. The walls of buildings are often set back from street. There are many eaves and verandas on the walls. The forms of the roofs are complicated. I made some simple graphic models of streetscapes in the West and the East, and categorized them according to their compositions. By calculating their areas and compositions, I could confirm that in the most of the street in the East, there are many irregularities on the walls and disorderness of their streetscapes. It is quite interesting to me that in Europe, the building's elevations are often lined up along street. On the contrary, in Japanese cities, it is unlikely that building elevations will be tightly lined up along street. The arrangement and heights of buildings look cluttered and disordered. I think that the distinctive characteristics of Japanese cities lie not in configurations of front elevations, but in three-dimensional configurations, which are comprised of an accumulation of buildings with various plans and heights.
This is a distribution map of building heights in Shibuya, which is one of major city centers in Tokyo.
We can observe the accumulation of various building heights. Actually, there are many low-rise buildings even in this high-density city center. This is a model of Shinjuku, one of the most high-density city centers in Tokyo. Another example of the disorder is the cityscape of Asakusa, one of old city centers in Tokyo. In the Serbian conference at Belgrade, I presented a method of an automatic generation of three-dimensional compositions of some city centers in Tokyo, using numerical maps in which the plane shapes of the buildings are described. Cityscapes were generated by presuming variation of building heights. When the buildings are categorized into groups of different scales based on their plane areas, the three-dimensional configuration of the cityscapes could be represented by the average height and the deviation of the building height. Now, I would like to talk about contemporary Japanese plazas. At the 2015 conference in Brasov, I made a presentation about Japanese pedestrian decks. I took a notice that pedestrian decks in Japan may have some similarity with European plazas. A number of pedestrian decks have been constructed in these 40 years, especially in Tokyo metropolitan area. Basically, pedestrian decks are railway station annex facilities. They are overpass bridges to promote effective use of space in front of railway stations. Unlike plazas, pedestrian decks are not enclosed by the continuous elevations of peripheral buildings. However, as pedestrian decks are lifted from the ground, they have distinctive domain, so I think I can call it plaza. On the pedestrian deck, beside the flow of people stops for rendezvous, rest, performances, and so on. Sometimes the pedestrian deck turns to be an event space. These are the plain forms of pedestrian decks. Mostly they have linear shapes. The difference in plane forms of the European plazas and the Japanese pedestrian decks can be explained by the relationship of the areas and the circumferences. Generally, the circumferences of pedestrian decks are long and the areas are small, whereas plazas have the opposite dimensions. Interestingly, some plane forms looks like a bird, a bug, an animal, or a character, like the Nazca lines in Peru. These plaza-like spaces are conformed among this disordered cityscape. I think this is an example that shows similarity and difference of the West and the East. At the last of my talk, I would like to mention how we learn the history of the Western architecture. In Japan, there are no written history before the 8th century, as letters were not used in the ancient era. Besides, as Japanese historical architecture was made by woods, all of the architecture before the 8th century has disappeared. So, European history is important for us. I have a class to teach spaces and forms in architecture. The significant characteristics of the ancient Egyptian architecture is the image of mass of the gigantic external forms. As Japan is far away from Europe, for Japanese students, it is not easy to visit the West, so over the last few years, I have surveyed architecture and cities depicted in movies with students. The aesthetic composition are seen in the ancient Greek architecture,
and we can confirm them through movies.
In spite of that, the characteristics of the ancient Egyptian and the Greek architecture are seen in the external forms. The distinguishing interior spaces are appeared in the ancient Roman and Byzantine architecture. Their compositions can be seen on the movies such as Angels and Demons, 007, From Russia with Love, and so on. Dynamic and various compositions of spaces can be seen in the Romanesque architecture. I think in the West, contemporary cities are formed on the base of the medieval age, but it is unlikely in Japan. Gothic architecture is significant architectural heritage. Not only Harry Potter movies, we can observe many Gothic architecture in movies. After the Renaissance, architecture became to be designed by architects' ideas. For Japanese students, movies are often the first opportunities to know European architecture. From the bottom of my heart, I think I learned a lot from the West, and now I feel the Europe and Romania are my second home. Mulțumesc!